Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2014, after Russia moved into Crimea, NATO countries agreed to raise defense spending to at least 2% of their GDP by 2024. Last year, 8 years after that pledge, only 7 of the 30 NATO countries met that goal. Prosperous nations like France and Germany still lag well behind that goal. And I know there's been some discussion about when we're delivering tanks, but we're talking about over the course of that period of time, billions and billions and billions of dollars from NATO countries that seemingly refuse to ante up to protect themselves and Europe. And so, General, I want to ask you a question. If those additional billions of dollars would have been designated for defense, wouldn't that have gone a long way in deterring Russian aggression?
Sir, thanks for the question. First of all, you would have to look pretty far to find somebody who was a bigger advocate than me of all our allies spending 2%. In fact, in my confirmation hearings, I made clear that I consider 2% to be a floor.
Right.
There are shopping lists that have to be filled out there. There are readiness requirements that have to be filled out there, and they're going to require money, and I believe 2% is a floor, not a ceiling. Where we are right now, so in 2014, we had an average spending of 1.4% of GDP, sir, across the alliance. Now we're at 1.8%, which is still short. We've got 10 allies with the addition of Finland this year. We've got 10 allies who currently spend 2% or more. We've got 11 allies who have a credible plan to get there, some of them enshrined in law, to get there by 24, which was the goal, but that leaves 10. And
yeah, and I have to tell you,
I encourage them to.
Yeah, and I know you're in kind of a unique position with your role, but I have to tell you, in the United States, I think it's like 54% of the share of the GDP of all those NATO countries, and we provide 70% of the funding. I think the American taxpayer is getting a little weary, essentially, of subsidizing these Western democratic socialist states. So when they're not investing in their military to defend their backyard, they're using that money on social programs that we may or may not agree with, but yet the United States continues to have to hold the bag. And we're having legitimate questions today about delivery of weapon systems, but I would argue that if they were actually meeting what they should be doing on their own continent, Russian aggression would have either been deterred or, Ukraine would have what they need. And I want to ask about one country in particular, France. President Macron recently visited communist dictator Xi and said that it's not in Europe's interest to strongly support Taiwan and stand allied with the United States. I find this comment, by the way, totally insane. Do you have a sense that France is on their way to meeting their NATO obligations, this amount of funding? Because that's a pretty bold statement for the president of a country that kind of refuses to live up to their own commitments.
Senator, I of course, read the coverage of those comments and everything, and I think I'll leave commentary on them to my civilian leadership.
Fair enough.
I am a huge advocate of burden sharing, sir, and I believe the plans that we're working on in NATO will create the blueprint to get to that.
Well, that's probably a question more for Secretary Blinken. General Van Ovost, I want to ask you, after the disastrous withdrawal of from Afghanistan by President Biden, what was left behind was $48 million worth of ammunition, 80 aircraft, 23,000 Humvees, 250,000 automatic rifles, 95 drones, 42,000 pieces of night vision surveillance, biometric, and positioning equipment. I mean, it's unbelievable. And of course, you were charged with scrambling and saving over 19,000 people from perhaps one of the most embarrassing moments in American foreign policy history. My question to you is, where did all that equipment go? Where is it? Do we know?
Senator, I'm not familiar with where the equipment is, but I could tell you that the Afghanistan retrograde presented really an unprecedented situation. We had a rapidly evolving security deterioration there on the ground, and I am proud of how the U.S. service members were able to evacuate and take care of our Afghan citizens.
No, I agree, and I applaud you for that. And in fact, a serviceman from Missouri, Jared Schmitt, lost his life that day. And I don't think we talk about it enough. I mean, I believe this would be bipartisan. What happened there is inexcusable. And I just mentioned the equipment, not the loss of life, to compound all of that. And I know you were charged with that. And just finally, well, I'm out of time. I just appreciate what you do. But the idea that we left all of that behind and lost those lives, and there's not a word of it. In fact, I guess a most recent report was trying to blame a previous administration and inject politics into this. It was just an abject failure by this administration, and we ought to get to the bottom of it, make sure it never happens again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.